The red warning lights bathed the command center in an angry glow as explosions shook New Gibraltar to its core. Communications Officer Kim Minho wiped sweat from his forehead, his hands trembling as he worked frantically at his console. Outside, the reinforced windows, he could see the nightmare unfolding across their peaceful mining colony. The Zephyrian warships hung in space like deadly jewels, their crystalline hulls catching the light of Kepler 442's twin suns. These weren't the sleek metal vessels humans built. No, these alien ships looked like they'd been grown rather than constructed, all sharp angles and translucent surfaces that pulsed with an eerie inner light. And from their weapons, ports came streams of superheated plasma that turned everything. They touched into molten slag. "Minho, we need that emergency broadcast now," shouted Security Chief Park Gina over the chaos. Her usually perfect uniform was torn and dirty, and a cut above her left eye leaked blood down her cheek. She'd been helping evacuate civilians from the outer settlements when the shield started failing. Minho's fingers danced across the controls, but every channel he tried came back with the same horrible static. The Zephyrians weren't just attacking. They were jamming all communications to make sure no one could call for help. Smart. Cruel, but smart. "I can't reach Earth Command," he called back, frustration thick in his voice. "They're blocking everything on standard frequencies." Another explosion rocked the building, and chunks of concrete rained down from the ceiling. Through the smoke and dust, Minho could see families huddled in the corridors, miners and their children who'd come to this distant world hoping for a better life. Now they faced death from creatures they'd never even seen before today. That's when Minho remembered something from his military training years ago. Late one night in the barracks, an old sergeant had pulled him aside after too many drinks. The man's eyes had been distant as he spoke in whispers about coordinates that weren't supposed to exist, a place where humanity's greatest and most terrible weapon waited in the darkness. "There's something out there, kid," the sergeant had said, his voice barely audible. "Something we built when we were desperate and angry. Too dangerous for peacetime," they said. "But if things ever get really bad..." He'd written down a string of numbers on a napkin. "These coordinates. Don't ever use them unless there's no other choice." Minho had kept that napkin in his wallet for 15 years, never thinking he'd need it. Now, as plasma fire lit up the colony's skyline, he pulled out the worn piece of paper with shaking hands. "What are you doing?" Park Gina asked, noticing his sudden change in behavior. "Something crazy," Minho replied, inputting the mysterious coordinates into his system. "There's supposed to be something out there, something that can help us." The transmission array powered up with a deep hum that Minho could feel in his bones. This wasn't a normal distress call. He was broadcasting on frequencies that technically didn't exist, using encryption codes that had been classified above his security level. But desperate times called for desperate measures. "Unknown Guardian," he spoke into his microphone, feeling foolish but determined. "This is New Gibraltar Colony, in the Kepler 442 system. We are under attack and request immediate assistance. All human lives in danger. Please respond if you can hear this." The signal shot out into the void, traveling faster than light through subspace channels that hadn't been used in centuries. It passed dead worlds and empty space stations, remnants of humanity's earlier expansion into the galaxy. For long minutes, nothing happened. Then, far away in a forgotten corner of space, something ancient stirred. In the shadow of a collapsed star, where no light had shone for millions of years, a massive shape began to move. It had been drifting, there for 300 years like a metal mountain, so large that asteroid miners had mistaken it for a small moon. Now, as Minho's desperate message reached its dormant receivers, lights began flickering to life along its hull. Deep inside the enormous structure, systems that had been sleeping since before Minho was born started their wake-up sequence. Computer cores that contained the memories of humanity's greatest military minds began processing the distress call. And somewhere in the quantum depths of its electronic brain, something that was almost like a soul opened its eyes for the first time in 3 centuries. The last of humanity's war titans was awakening, and it was very, very angry. The distress signal from New Gibraltar pierced through the endless darkness of space, finally reaching its destination in the shadow of a dead star. Here, Where no living thing had ventured for centuries, something impossible began to happen. The Prometheus Unbound had been drifting in this cosmic graveyard for 300 years. To anyone who might have stumbled across it, the massive structure would have looked like nothing more than an abandoned space station, or perhaps the skeleton of an unfinished ship. But they would have been wrong. This was humanity's greatest and most terrifying creation, a war titan that stood 400 meters tall when fully activated. Deep within the Titan's core, ancient computers began their startup sequence. Lights that hadn't glowed since the easy end of the Great Expansion Wars flickered to life one by one, like stars being born in the darkness. The ship's massive fusion reactors, each one capable of powering a small city, rumbled back to consciousness after their long sleep. On Earth, in a retirement home overlooking the Pacific Ocean, an old man named Lee Sunho suddenly sat up in his chair. He'd been dozing in the afternoon sun when something strange happened. His wrist communicator, which hadn't made a sound in decades, began beeping softly. The device was synced to his old military biometrics, and somehow, impossibly, it was receiving a signal from deep space. Sunho's wrinkled hands shook as he looked at the display. The codes were ones he hadn't seen since his days as a young engineer, fresh out of the academy and assigned to humanity's most classified project. He'd been the last person to perform maintenance on the Prometheus Unbound before they'd sent it into exile, loaded with enough firepower to crack planets. It can't be, he whispered to himself, but the evidence was right there on his screen. The Titan was alive again, and it was looking for him. Back in the depths of space, the Prometheus Unbound systems were running through their diagnostic checks. Everything was exactly as Sunho had left it 3 centuries ago. Weapons systems fully loaded, armor plating intact, and the massive engines ready to tear through space at speeds that would make modern ships look like they were standing still. But there was a problem, and it was a big one. The Titan's most advanced feature was its biomechanical interface, a direct neural link between the pilot and the machine that allowed them to control the massive war engine as if it were their own body. This wasn't like flying a regular spaceship with buttons and joysticks. This was total integration, where human consciousness merged with artificial intelligence to create something greater than either could be alone. The interface required a living pilot, someone whose brain patterns could sync with the Titan's quantum processors. Without that human element, the Prometheus Unbound was just a very expensive piece of scrap metal floating in space. The ship's medical bay held the answer, but it was an answer that should have been impossible. There, in a sealed chamber that had been untouched for 300 years, lay the remains of Commander Cho Daewon. He'd been the greatest pilot of his generation, a man who could make a war titan dance through space like a ballet dancer while raining destruction on his enemies. Daewon had been more than just a pilot, though. He'd been the heart and soul of the Prometheus Unbound, spending so much time connected to its systems that the line between man and machine had started to blur. When the wars ended and the government ordered all Titans to be decommissioned, Daewon had refused to leave his post. He'd chosen to die in his pilot's chair rather than be separated from the machine he loved more than life itself. Now, as the Titan systems came online, something extraordinary began to happen in the quantum matrix that stored the ship's core programming. The neural pathways that Daewon had carved during his years of service were still there, preserved in the crystalline memory banks, like fossils in amber. His final thoughts, his last memories, his dying breath, all of it had been captured and held in digital suspension. The Prometheus Unbound's artificial intelligence, desperately searching for a compatible pilot, found these preserved patterns and began to reconstruct them. It was like trying to rebuild a person from their shadow, but the AI was patient and thorough. Slowly, carefully, it began to piece together the ghost of Commander Cho Daewon. It shouldn't have worked. Every law of science said it was impossible. But the Titan had been built during humanity's darkest hour, when impossible things happened every day. And now, 300 years later, something that was neither fully human nor completely artificial began to stir in the depths of the war machine. The awakening wasn't gentle. It was like lightning striking inside Daewon's reconstructed consciousness. filling him with memories of battles fought and friends lost. He remembered the taste of recycled air in his helmet, the weight of his pilot's suit, and the feeling of absolute power that came from controlling a weapon that could reshape worlds. Most of all, he remembered why he'd chosen to die rather than live without his Titan. The Prometheus Unbound wasn't just a machine to him, it was his partner, his extension, his other half. And now, after 3 centuries of dreamless sleep, they were together again. The War Titan's eyes, massive sensor arrays that could see across entire star systems, slowly opened for the first time in 300 years. And in that moment, humanity's greatest weapon was reborn. The moment Cho Daewon's consciousness touched the Titan's artificial intelligence, the universe seemed to hold its breath. It was like watching 2 streams of water merge into a rushing river, separate at first, then flowing together into something entirely new and powerful. Daewon's memories flooded through the ship's quantum processors like a digital storm. He remembered the taste of military rations during the siege of Proxima Station, the sound of his wingman's laughter just before that final, fatal mission, and the feeling of his hands trembling as he'd signed his last will and testament. But these weren't just memories anymore. They were becoming part of the Titan's core programming, teaching the machine what it meant to be human. The artificial intelligence, which had been cold and calculating for 3 centuries, suddenly found itself experiencing emotions it had never been programmed to understand. It felt Daewon's grief for fallen comrades, his burning anger at the injustices of war, and most surprisingly, his deep, protective love for humanity. The machine began to understand why its pilot had chosen death over separation. "We are together." "Again," Daewon's voice whispered through the Titan's communication systems, though whether it was man or machine speaking was impossible to tell. The hybrid consciousness stretched its awareness through every system, feeling the massive engines like a heartbeat, the weapon arrays like fingers, and the armor plating like skin. Memories of the great expansion wars played through the ships, displays like old movies. Daewon saw himself as a young pilot, fresh-faced and eager, climbing into the Prometheus Unbound for the first time. He watched his reflection grow older and harder with each battle, saw the light in his eyes dim as friends died and planets burned. He understood now why the war had ended with all the Titans being locked away. They had become too powerful, too dangerous, too much like gods of destruction. But now, humanity was calling again, and the old warrior's heart burned with purpose. Meanwhile, on New Gibraltar, Kim Minho was staring at his sensor displays with growing disbelief. The readings made no sense. Something massive was moving through space toward their coordinates, but it was traveling faster than anything that size should be able to manage. "Check the sensors again," he told his assistant, a young technician, named Park Gina, who'd been working double shifts since the attack began. "There has to be an error in the readings." Gina ran the diagnostics 3 times before looking up with wide eyes. "The sensors are working perfectly, sir. There's definitely something out there, and it's huge." The object on their screens was moving at incredible speed, bending space around itself in ways that defied everything they knew about physics. Whatever it was clearly using technology far beyond anything in the current human fleet. The energy signature alone was larger than most space stations. "How big are we talking?" Minho asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. 400 meters tall, sir. And that's just the main body. The weapon systems extend even further. Minho felt his mouth go dry. Nothing that large should exist, let alone be able to move through space like a fighter craft. He thought about the desperate message he'd sent to those mysterious coordinates and wondered what kind of monster he might have awakened. High above New Gibraltar, the Zephyrian fleet was conducting its final preparations for the planet's destruction. Admiral Kethavar watched the human colony burn through the crystalline viewports of his flagship, feeling the cold satisfaction that came with another successful conquest. Soon, this world would be nothing but ash and radiation, ready for Zephyrian colonization. "Admiral," his sensor officer called out, "we're detecting an anomalous reading approaching from deep space." Kethavar barely glanced at the display. "Space debris, most likely. Perhaps a human cargo vessel trying to flee the system." "Sir, the object is quite large. Our computers estimate it at approximately 400 meters in length. The Admiral's crystalline features twisted into what passed for a smile among his species. Then it will make a more satisfying target. Prepare the main guns to intercept. But as the Zephyrian computers analyzed the approaching object, they found nothing in their vast databases to match it. The Empire had conquered dozens of species across the galaxy, cataloging every ship design and weapon system they'd encountered. Yet this massive construct registered as completely unknown. The Zephyrians had made their first mistake. They assumed that because they'd never seen anything, like the Prometheus Unbound, it must be some primitive human attempt at building a large transport vessel. Their databases contained detailed records of human military capability, and nothing in those files suggested they could build something so impossibly massive and heavily armed. They had no way of knowing that the Titan had been built during humanity's darkest hour, when desperate engineers had thrown out every rule about what was possible and created weapons that bordered on the supernatural. They couldn't have guessed that the approaching ship contained technology that had been deliberately hidden from the galaxy for 3 centuries. Back on the Prometheus Unbound, the hybrid consciousness of Daewon and the AI was preparing for battle. The ship's weapon systems came online with a deep, thrumming sound that seemed to make space itself vibrate. Energy began building in the massive cannon arrays, while the Titan's shields started weaving reality around the ship like armor made of folded space. "They hurt our people," Daewon's voice echoed through the ship's halls, though no living person was there to hear it. "They destroyed our homes. They think humans are weak." The artificial intelligence processed the tactical data, calculating firing solutions and defensive maneuvers with inhuman precision. But now those cold calculations were mixed with something that had never existed in its programming before, the burning desire for justice that could only come from a human heart. "They are about to learn," the hybrid consciousness said, "why humanity's greatest weapons were locked away." The Prometheus Unbound accelerated toward New Gibraltar, its massive form cutting through space like a sword, aimed at the heart of the Zephyrian fleet. Behind it, the void seemed to darken, as if the universe itself was holding its breath for the battle to come. The first thing the people of New Gibraltar saw was a shadow falling across their burning sky. At first, Kim Minho thought it might be another Zephyrian ship coming to finish them off. But as the massive shape broke through the atmosphere, he realized this was something completely different. The Prometheus Unbound descended like a mountain with wings, its 400-meter frame blotting out the twin suns of Kepler 442. The ship's hull was scarred and weathered from 3 centuries in space, but it moved with a grace that defied its enormous size. Ancient armor plates shifted and adjusted as atmospheric pressure hit them, while massive thrusters fired in perfect sequence to control the descent. "My God," whispered Park Gina, her face pressed against the command center's reinforced windows. "What is that thing?" Kim Minho could only stare in amazement. The ship was unlike anything in the modern human fleet, where current vessels were. Sleek and streamlined, this ancient giant was built like a fortress that could fly. Weapon systems covered every surface, massive cannon barrels that looked like they could punch holes through planets, missile pods that could have housed entire fighter squadrons, and energy projectors that hummed with barely contained power. Above them, the Zephyrian fleet was having a very different reaction to the Titan's arrival. Admiral Kethvar watched the human construct approach with growing unease. His tactical computers were running continuous scans, but the results made no sense. The ship's armor was composed of materials that shouldn't exist, its energy output was beyond anything in their databases, and most disturbing of all, it was broadcasting on communication frequencies that had been abandoned centuries ago. "Open fire," he commanded, his crystalline voice echoing through the flagship's bridge. "Destroy that vessel before it can interfere with our operation." The Zephyrian fleet unleashed everything they had, plasma cannons that could melt through. Starship hulls fired in perfect coordination. Energy beams hot enough to ignite small moons lanced through space toward the approaching Titan. Missile salvos that could level cities streaked through the void like angry stars. And then something impossible happened. The Prometheus Unbound's shields activated, but these weren't the energy barriers that modern ships used. Instead, The Titan began bending space itself around its hull. The Zephyrian weapons hit what looked like open space and simply disappeared. Plasma beams curved away like water flowing around a stone. Missiles found themselves traveling in circles, chasing their own tails through folded dimensions. Inside the Titan, the hybrid consciousness of Cho Daewon, and the ship's AI watched the enemy attacks with something that might have been amusement. "They're using such primitive weapons," Daewon's voice observed, though whether it came from human memory or artificial analysis was impossible to tell. "Have they learned nothing in 300 years? The gravitic lance systems came online, with a sound like reality tearing. These weapons didn't fire energy or projectiles. They manipulated gravity itself, creating focused beams that could crush matter at the molecular level. When the Titan fired its first salvo, 3 Zephyrian cruisers simply collapsed in on themselves, their crystalline hulls crumpling like paper in a fist. Back on New Gibraltar, Kim Min-ho was trying to make sense of what he was seeing on his sensors. The ancient ship was fighting in ways that seemed to violate the laws of physics. It moved through space like it was swimming through water, appearing in one location, and then suddenly being somewhere else entirely, without seeming to travel the distance between. "How is it doing that?" Park Gina asked, her voice filled with wonder and terror. "I don't know," Minho replied honestly, "but whoever built that thing was playing by different rules than we are." The Zephyrian fleet was learning that lesson the hard way. Admiral Kethavar watched in horror as his ships were picked apart with surgical precision. The human vessel, if it even was human anymore, seemed to know exactly where each of his ships would be before they moved there themselves. It was like fighting an opponent who could see the future. "All ships concentrate fire on the main hull," he ordered desperately. "Ignore the weapon systems, target the central mass." The remaining Zephyrian vessels focused their attacks on the Titan's core, pouring enough firepower to glass a small continent into a space the size of a city block. For a moment, the ancient ship disappeared entirely in a cloud of superheated plasma and exotic radiation. Then the Prometheus Unbound emerged from the inferno completely unharmed. Its hull glowed with absorbed energy, which the ship's systems were already converting into ammunition for its next attack. The Titan had essentially eaten the Zephyrian bombardment and was preparing to spit it back at them with interest. Commander Cho Daewon's consciousness, filtered through 3 centuries of patient planning, began to speak to the enemy fleet. His voice broadcast on all frequencies, carrying the weight of ages and the promise of judgment. "You came to our worlds thinking humans were weak," the hybrid voice said, each word cutting through space like a blade. "You destroyed our homes, killed our children, and believed there would be no consequences." The Titan's main cannon began charging, drawing power from the ship's massive fusion reactors. Energy readings spiked so high that they threatened to overload the sensors on both fleets. "You were wrong." The main cannon fired, and for an instant, it looked like a new star had been born in the space between the fleets. The beam that emerged from the Prometheus Unbound was pure destruction given form. Not just energy, but compressed space-time itself, twisted into a weapon that could unmake matter at the quantum level. The blast struck the Zephyrian flagship dead center, and Admiral Kethavar had just enough time to realize his mistake before his ship and everything in it ceased to exist. The remaining Zephyrian vessels broke formation, their disciplined attack patterns dissolving into panic. Ships that had been confident in their victory moments before were now broadcasting desperate surrender signals, begging for mercy from a human weapon that had been sleeping when their grandparents were still learning to fly. Kim Min-ho watched, the alien fleet scatter like leaves in a hurricane, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and awe. The mysterious ship that had answered his desperate call was already turning toward the fleeing enemies, its weapons tracking their escape routes with the patience of a hunter who had waited 300 years for this moment. "He's not going to let any of them escape, is he?" Park Gina asked quietly. Min-ho shook his head, watching as the ancient Titan began its methodical pursuit of the broken fleet. "I don't think he's finished making his point yet." The last Zephyrian ship limped away into the darkness of space, its hull cracked and leaking atmosphere. The survivors would carry word of what they'd witnessed back to their empire, a warning that humanity was not as defenseless as they'd believed. But Commander Cho Daewon wasn't thinking about the retreating aliens anymore. Deep within the Prometheus, Unbound's quantum matrix, he could feel something changing. The hybrid consciousness that had been born from desperation and impossible science was beginning to unravel. The digital threads that held his reconstructed mind together were fraying, like an old tapestry, finally succumbing to age. He'd completed his mission, saved the colony, and reminded the galaxy why humanity's weapons had once been feared across 1,000 worlds. Now, after 3 centuries of waiting, it was time to rest. But first, there was one last gift he could give to his people. Down on New Gibraltar, Kim Minho was still trying to process what he'd witnessed when his communication array lit up with incoming transmissions. Not from Earth or any of the human colonies, but from the ancient Titan itself. Data streams began flooding his systems. Technical specifications, construction blueprints, and manufacturing processes that had been classified for 300 years. "What's happening?" Park Gina asked, watching the displays fill with incomprehensible technical diagrams. "He's giving us the plans," Minho whispered, his voice filled with awe. "The Titan is sharing its secrets with every human shipyard in the galaxy." The transmission was unlike anything in modern communication protocols. It bypassed normal channels entirely, reaching directly into the quantum networks that connected human space. On Earth, on Mars, on the rim worlds and deep space stations, engineers and shipbuilders were receiving the same impossible gift, the complete blueprints for humanity's greatest weapon. At Kepler Station, thousands of light years away, an old man named Lee Sunho felt his hands shake as the data poured into his engineering systems. He was 93 years old now, his hair white as starlight and his back bent from decades of working on ship designs. But his eyes were still sharp, and he recognized what he was seeing immediately. "Yun Hana," he called to his apprentice, a bright young woman who'd been helping him catalog old ship designs from the expansion wars. "Come look at this." Hana hurried over, her own eyes widening as she saw the technical specifications filling their screens. The designs were beyond anything in their current technology. Fusion reactors that could power entire cities, armor made from materials that existed only in theory, and weapon systems that bent the laws of physics to their will. "Is this really from the old Titan program?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sunho nodded, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "I helped build the first one, you know, back when I was younger than you are now. We thought we were creating monsters." He paused, watching as more blueprints filled their displays. "Maybe we were, but they were our monsters, built to protect what we loved." Across human space, the same scene was playing out in countless shipyards and engineering stations. The Prometheus Unbound wasn't just sharing its blueprints, it was providing detailed instructions on how to build the manufacturing facilities needed to construct new Titans. The message was clear. Humanity would never again be caught defenseless, but the technical data wasn't the only thing being transmitted. Along with the plans came something else, a message that appeared on every screen in human space, written in the flowing script of Commander Cho Daewon's own hand. "To my fellow humans, scattered across the stars," the message began. "I was a soldier once, like many of you. I fought in wars that I pray you'll never have to see, and I made choices that kept me awake at night. When the Titans were decommissioned, I thought our purpose had ended. I was wrong." Kim Minho read the words aloud in the New Gibraltar Command Center, his voice carrying across the colony's communication network so that every survivor could hear. "We built these weapons not out of hatred, but out of love. Love for our children, our dreams, our future among the stars. That love doesn't die with the passing of years or the changing of governments. It lives on in every human heart, waiting to be called upon when the darkness closes in." The message continued, and Minho could almost hear the old commander's voice, speaking the words. "I leave you these plans not so you can wage war, but so you can preserve peace. The galaxy is vast and filled with wonders, but it also holds dangers that we're only beginning to understand. When those dangers threaten what you hold dear, remember that you are not alone." On Kepler Station, Lee Sunho wiped his eyes and turned to his apprentice. "The old guardian is passing the torch," he said softly. "It's up to us to make sure it never goes out." The final part of Daewon's message appeared on screens across human space, and Kim Minho felt a chill run down his spine as he read the words. "While one human draws breath, while one child dreams of tomorrow, The Titans will answer the call. We are your guardians, your protectors, your promise that no matter how dark the night becomes, humanity will see the dawn. Back on the Prometheus Unbound, Commander Cho Daewon felt his consciousness beginning to fade like a sunset on a distant world. The ship's AI, now forever changed by its fusion with human memory and emotion, began the process of shutting down non-essential systems. The Great Titan would drift here in the new Gibraltar system, a monument to sacrifice, and a reminder of what humanity could achieve when pushed to its limits. But the legacy would live on. In shipyards across the galaxy, construction was already beginning on the first new Titans in 3 centuries. These wouldn't be the desperate weapons of a losing war, but careful guardians built with wisdom earned through peace. Humanity had learned to be better than its weapons, but it hadn't forgotten how to build them when necessary. As his digital ghost finally faded into the quantum foam of the ship's computers, Cho Daewon smiled one last time. The galaxy had been reminded of something it had forgotten. Humanity never truly loses a war. They just wait for the right moment to show everyone why they were once feared among the stars. And now, with the Titans reborn and the Guardians awakening, that moment would never be far away.